Capital Views is sponsored by Northrim Bank, Alaska Oil and Gas Association, ConocoPhillips, and Linden.
Hi, I'm Tim Bradner with the Alaska Legislative Digest, and welcome to Capitol Views. And a special welcome today to Bryan Butcher, the Executive Director of Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. Bryan, Alaska Housing, or AHFC as we know it, has been around for years, and you're involved in a tremendous amount of housing issues around the state, ranging from helping Alaskans get mortgages to rural teacher housing construction, low income housing. So it's amazing the breadth of your programs. But I think what's probably concerning a lot of people these days is just the sheer scope of the national and the state housing situation. I mean, things are not looking very good in a lot of respects. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me on, Tim. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of the housing challenges, because I think a lot of times when people look at housing, they look at it in terms of their own house. If I have a house, then the housing situation must be good, without noticing a whole lot about what's going on. And so when you look nationally, you're seeing kind of a real freezing of the housing market. There's almost no supply. Interest rates are up. And that's really been problematic, because you've got approximately 2/3 of mortgage holders having mortgages under 4%. Many of them under 3%. And now that you look at 6%, 6.5% for mortgages, you've got all these people that own homes not wanting to sell. And these may be a young couple that bought a condo or a starter home that have now had a couple of kids and now need a larger home, but they don't want to get rid of their low interest rate house to go to a much higher. So you don't see a lot of people putting their houses on the market, which means people in apartments that are now financially able to buy a house have difficulty doing so because there's nothing available on the market. And then there's just kind of paralysis at every level. And if you've got folks in apartments not moving into their own homes, you're having difficulty with people wanting to move into apartments. And we see with the homelessness issues we're dealing with, not just in Alaska, but nationally, that it's kind of a cascading effect, that when you're not seeing homes being available for purchase at higher levels, that it impacts all levels of society in terms of trying to be comfortable with where they are in their housing.
Yeah, you can understand the ripple effect of all that. Is this the case in Alaska too, Bryan?
Yeah, absolutely it is. We see about 2/3 we have about anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of the mortgages in the state. And we see about 2/3 of our mortgages, as I mentioned, being very low interest rates. So when Alaskans are looking at doing something, they're now looking at renovations to houses. Okay, if we don't want to move out of our 1,200 square foot home to something larger, we'll just add on to our 1,200 square foot home. But it's got to be very frustrating for folks that are looking to buy a house, because now not only do they have less buying power because interest rates have gone up, but there's not a whole lot on the market. And I feel like I should add that, we look at 6% interest rates as, wow, if you look over the last decade, that seems crazy high compared to what they were. But what they were the lowest interest rates we've seen in many generations. And if you talk to my parents' generation, who had a 14% and 16% mortgage in the 80s, 6%, they would have been jumping for joy. So if you look at it with a little bit of perspective, you see that where we are right now with interest rates is pretty average from what we've seen over the last 100 years.
That's interesting. But when people talk about renovations and major additions to houses, you run into the labor shortage, materials costs. What are you hearing about escalation, inflation with building materials, and the difficulty of contractors and home building getting workers?
Yeah, I mean, it's really kind of piled on top of each other. You've got land problems talk about Anchorage as an example. There's not a lot of, most buildable land's been built on. And so you're dealing with marshland and land that's going to cost a lot more to develop. Now you're adding materials costs with supply chain issues. Materials have been probably the highest they've ever been. You add on the transportation costs of getting it to Alaska, and then on top of that, you add on the labor shortage and being unable to find people. And if you talk to home builders 5 years ago, they'd have told you that they were limited on how many homes they could build because they just couldn't hire enough people. And that was before the pandemic, where we're seeing a lot more difficulties across all sectors in hiring. So unfortunately, there's not an easy solution to this because there's so many layers to it. We just kind of have to work at trying to improve all of them to make it overall a little bit easier and a little bit more economic to build homes, because that's what we really need to do, not just in Alaska, but nationwide, to expand the housing stock.
So these problems really ripple nationwide also, not just in Alaska.
Oh yeah,
Like,
absolutely. Absolutely. I'm on a national housing board. Every single state is dealing with these issues.
is the looking at the labor shortage, why is it just a matter we don't have enough carpenters, or can we bring in carpenters from the lower 48? I mean, there's a real upsurge in oil work in the North Slope, and so the solution to that seems to be bringing in people from out of state. But can we do that with carpenters and home builders also?
Yeah, and that's a nationwide shortage in the construction industry as well, not just Alaska. It's very difficult, and it's the home builders have really been working at trying to get into the high schools and letting a lot of folks know, because a large percentage of Americans don't go to college, and quite a few that do don't end up finishing in college. So there's a lot of people looking for jobs, and if you want to talk about a high-paying job, the construction industry is great. And so they're thinking there's probably a lot of people out there working jobs, probably making less money than they could to help support their families. And so it's really an attempt to try to connect young people to see the opportunities they have in the trades.
It's always been seemed an irony to me that you have people underemployed and unemployed looking for jobs, and yet there's all these jobs in the construction industry or in other trades also that pay well, and we can't seem to connect the two. And I know the Department of Labor is doing a lot of things to try to do that, but it just seems like a amazingly difficult problem that we can't solve.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that uh, until you actually kind of dig into what the job is, you don't really realize the benefits, you don't realize the pay, and you don't realize the fact that, you're not standing outside pounding nails at 10 below zero in the wintertime. There's so much to the job that it's a lot more comfortable job than somebody might think at first blush when they see somebody, like I said, working on a roof in the wintertime and thinking, well, gee, I wouldn't want that job. That's a very small amount of the work that you would actually do in that particular field.
Well, Brian, thanks. This very challenging times and very difficult issue to solve. Thank you for joining us. It's been interesting.
Absolutely, my pleasure, Tim, anytime.